Our dam has a name. Its name is Inuru, which is not actually an English name. It's an ancient language Sumerian name. It means light. So what we see our dam like is like a source of inspiration and a source of light. Light also obviously being the principal ingredient of photography. It means light in a range of languages, also including Arabic, for example. And we're good now where we are with our dam, but it's been quite a trajectory. And I'll hopefully take you through a bit of that trajectory and then tell you about the lessons that we learned from that. But let's start with the start, which is Oxfam. So we're all about an equal future. You might know us from Oxfam shops or Oxfam fundraising campaigns against inequality for gender issues, the humanitarian work that we do in many of the crises around the world. That is Oxfam. Just a couple of numbers, we work with more than 4,000 local partner organizations across the world. We work in 90 countries, in over 90 countries. We have nearly 80 years of experience working in those countries. And last year we've been able to help, with our partners, of course, 25.7 million people across the globe. And we are, as David pointed to, a confederation of 21 affiliates. If you hear Oxfam, you might think, you know, Oxfam is Oxfam. It's one organization, and obviously we are, and we're one brand, and there's a lot of things we do together. But the fact that we are also 21 national affiliate organizations coming together has a very large impact on how you manage these global scale projects, really. Because affiliates is largely where decision making happens. It is where the budget sits. It's where the content production happens. It's where the ownership of the content sits and the rights, etc., etc., etc. So you can already hopefully see that has a large impact on what a dam looks like. I've been presenting this presentation, or actually this was the last slide of my presentation that I did on this very conference 3 years ago. Because that is like, you know, the top of the mountain is where we felt we were back then. The presentation was about the business case that we built for our digital asset management system and all of the challenges that we went through building that business case. So we felt pretty good at that stage. And I think all we needed, or we felt that we needed to do, is to get here. So that was June 2019. And we thought, well, March 2020, we'll have this implementation all done and dusted, and that'll be it. It turned out that there was another mountain that we would have to climb. And it was actually March 2022, this year, before we were able to terminate that, well, to finish that journey. But let's start with the start. It's not a usual challenge. I've just explained a bit about the fact that we're actually a networked organization and how that works, so that makes it very different. The content that we've got on our DAM system is also, it's personal stories, it's not products. So we've got photography, but a lot of the value sits in the stories that come with those photos. So the quotes of people in the pictures, the program information and project information that goes with that. So all of that really determines the value. And actually DAM is not just about, for us, it's not just about increasing the value or speed to market or communications or any of that. It's very much the essence of what we try and do. It's sharing the stories of the people that we work with, which is the essence of active citizenship, which is is one of the main things that Oxfam strives to achieve. So DAM is not just a tool, it's very much at the essence of the work that Oxfam does, I think. The fact that we're a networked organization also means that we used to have 8 different DAM systems in place for different national affiliate organizations. So that kind of determined where we came from. Taking just a step back, the business case, I won't do that whole presentation again, but then just share one of my favorite graphs from the business case, which sets out how assets within Oxfam were used prior to our new DAM system across time and across geographies. What you would see here is the number of times that an asset on average got used beyond its creation. And what you can see is that that usage drops very, very quickly after the point that it's been created. And this is obviously something that we wanted to change because we were investing a lot in capturing these stories from farmers in Mali, from human rights activists in Cambodia, et cetera, and what we were seeing is that while these stories could potentially be used and reused for many purposes for maybe 2 or 3 or 4 years, is, beyond month 1, they basically disappeared and they weren't used ever again. So we weren't making the most of it. And this is actually where we wanted to get to. This black graph line represents data that we got from our peers at MSF, who did implement global asset management system and were able to consistently, lift that longer tail over time, be able to repurpose and reuse those assets for a much, much longer time. And that is what we were aiming for. So increasing reuse, spending less time on searching and managing content, I think duplicating less assets as we felt we were duplicating a lot. Increasing the access of people to content and doing better public engagement in that sense. Increasing our global media coverage by giving journalists direct access to our content. Increasing staff satisfaction because of that, of course, and then also reducing ethical, legal, and brand risks that we felt that we were running. So that was kind of the business case. We built 2017, 2018. One thing we also did, I think, quite importantly, is work on in 2018 is creating a set of global ethical content guidelines. Before that, again, because of being different affiliate organizations, we had very different standards. And the standard against which content was produced in Australia was very different from Great Britain, for example, or Mali or Malawi. And if you don't actually do this, and I'll come back to that point, it becomes very difficult to implement global digital asset management because which of the workflows are you going to pick? And what are the criteria that you're going to set? So that was a really important piece for us. And those are kind of the foundations I feel that we started out with. And we felt the foundations were really good at that point. So we started preparations around the time of my previous presentation, working on things like user requirements, and we did a lot of technical requirements. I think in hindsight, probably far too much. We also did use case scenarios, which were very, very useful. We did a lot of work on taxonomy. We had 8 existing taxonomies, vocabularies. We came to, in total, I think, 75 metadata fields, of which more than half was controlled vocabulary, all of that in 3 languages. With hundreds of synonyms and then thousands of individual value-based mappings saying like, this value from that field in that taxonomy from that database needs to be mapped to this value in this field in the new taxonomy. Which, sounded quite simple at the time, but it definitely didn't turn out to be. We did a lot of work on workflows as well, trying to map what the workflow would be that the new system would support. All of that preparations, groundwork for the actual tool. So based on that, and with that in hand, we proceeded to the vendor selection. And we had the help for that of Theresa Wrigley, and present today as well, to help us with that, which I think was incredibly, incredibly useful. Looking at a thorough market analysis, and we were really aiming for something that would be software as a service, very quick to deploy, that had really good customer service, in-house support service as well, and obviously within our budget range, which you can imagine for us was a big factor. So that delivered 14 potential vendors that we could work with, who we sent a pre-qualification questionnaire with just a couple of questions really to gauge like what the main points would be. High-level functional requirements, not the full detail, but looking at things like their experience and financial stability, the commitment that they were showing, if we had to chase them like 3 times to get the answer to our questionnaire, that was telling us something about level of engagement as well, and then indicative pricing and how that would fit within our budget. That left us with 6 vendors who we sent the final RFP with the whole of the detail of the functional requirements. And we were left with 3 vendors at that stage. We went with them into the demo phase, in which you'll see we talked about things like functional requirements, but in the end we also assessed their level of system support, commitment, experience, long-term viability. We really consciously chose to not to look at the product, but not take that into account for more than 50% of the total assessment. Also be looking at the vendor side of things, which left us with 1 vendor with whom we engaged in contract negotiations and then finally signed a contract in December the 24th on Christmas Eve in that year. And that's where things started to get very ugly. So that was where the implementation started 2020. And there were different issues that we, after only 2 to 3 months, that we started running into. One was engagement. We had continuously had discussions in which the picture that was painted was like, the sky is the limit. If there's anything that you need, we'll be able to do that for you. And that very quickly evolved into a discourse of like, well, this is our off-the-shelf product and that is what it can do and that is what it will be able to do for you. So that very quickly shifted. Also, the people that we had talked to with the vendor, originally as part of the procurement process, completely disappeared when we actually signed the contract and we got to talk to other people, and that also created a very different relationship. The migration plans were changed. The actual mapping and all of that detailed work was going to be done by the vendor. In the end, we ended up having to do that ourselves because they weren't able to deliver that. In terms of functionality, it was a very, very basic thing, really, to be able to send an external link which was carrying more than one asset, a collection of assets with their metadata, turned out to be impossible, which is, to me, a pretty basic requirement. If we wanted to have someone submit content for approval, that had to happen asset by asset instead of bulk approval for a collection of assets, for example, which is all, again, pretty basic. Usability was a big issue. You would have things like, for example, yes, they were able to complete, for example, Spanish translations, but if you'd have a field with 10 values, the alphabetical order of those values would be the alphabetical order in English instead of being in Spanish, which is okay for 10 values, but if you have 100 values, it becomes completely unusable. And all of that detail, obviously, we hadn't written that in the contract. We had average response times that we were measuring across the different geographies we were working in of, I think, 8 to 9 seconds on any button on the platform, really. That run up to 20 to 30 seconds to 1 minute, depending on specific actions that people were taking, which was, that was a deal breaker in itself. So lots of issues, really. And we struggled a lot with that. Obviously, that was our first implementation of that size, at least the digital asset management within Oxfam. So we really struggled, with what we could expect and not expect as part of that engagement. In the end, it turned out we weren't able to continue, just because, we had to weigh the risk against the potential cost of terminating the contract. But we felt that the risk of us spending even more money as part of that contract, of in the end still having key functions not delivered, of poor engagement even after launch, and no guarantees at all that performance would actually increase and be up to standards, that those risks were actually higher than the cost of terminating the contract, which would be the sunk cost of the investment that we had already made, and the time lost, obviously, as part of the project, which led us to terminate the contract. It was a very ugly period, I think, as DAM professionals will all know. We don't like to spend our time, days and days sifting through contracts and talking to lawyers, because that's not what our job is. But that's been my job for a couple of weeks back then, for sure. The good news is that things change. Because after we abandoned the contract, we went back to our original vendor selection. And the one that came out second from that selection, we engaged in new conversations and negotiations with that vendor. And I'd say that the difference was kind of black and white in many respects. So in August, we were able to sign on a contract with them, August last year. In terms of functionality, we really decided to scale back on a number of our requirements and to go for the basics first, and then have things like integrations, etc., not cancelled but postponed as part of the plan. We actually had a history with them because they were providing the service for many of our existing DAM systems for affiliates, which also made it just much more easy for us to build on that existing relationship. In terms of performance, that having been such an issue, just the speed and the response times, we did a number of elaborate checks, and we also checked a lot with different customers of theirs, with similar kind of setups in terms of complexity, different geographies, permission level, volumes of assets, etc., which delivered no issues at all for any of those customers, which for us was really helpful in creating trust that we'd be in a good place moving forward. We'd had support, very extensive support at our fingertips. And as I think I mentioned to some of you yesterday, we read in the contract that it said that what they proposed said, well, there'd be no cap on support hours. And I went like, what? No cap on support hours? How is that even possible? So I took up the phone and I asked, is that even like real? What do you mean by that? They went like, there'll be no cap on support hours. We'll just provide you with the support until you're happy, which we were happy that was actually in the contract, and that's how it turned out to be, really. So that was really good, and it was actually 30% cheaper than what we were going to pay the previous vendor. So that was good as well. That was our second implementation, which we were able to deliver in February, which means that in March this year, we've been able to launch. We've got about 230,000 assets in the platform, mostly photos, but then video as well. There's 57 million values across these 75 different fields. We've got 850 users at this point. Each of those users have applied for an account themselves, which I think also tells something about how badly they need it, or how actively they engage with the platform. Since launch, we've had 120 asset views and more than 10,000 individual asset downloads, which, according to what we were expecting, was really, really good. In terms of the roadmap, we're looking to complete the delivery of the platform, and there's a number of smaller outstanding issues that we want to see solved. Focus on user onboarding, then talk about integrations. There's a lot of work that we're going to do on the governance for the platform as well. And then at the project side of things, looking at things like setting up a steering committee. I wanted to just take a step back and then tell you about the lessons that we have learned as Oxfam from this journey. We've got reason to believe that a lot of what went wrong with this first vendor that we worked with also has at least partially to do with internal dynamics within the vendor. So that's not something which was actually in our control or within our remit. But then there's a number of lessons that we were able to pull in any case, and those are the things that I'd like to focus on. First of all, I think it's really important, especially if you're like in this kind of complicated international setup, as we were, to think about processes first and the tool after that. Remember what I was saying about the global ethical content guidelines that we created? If you don't do that first, you'll eventually, once you have the tool, the vendor will ask you, well, how do we configure this workflow? And you won't be able to answer that question because you don't have that at the global level for your organization. So I think that's an important thing, which we actually did well, I think. But there's a lot of things that we didn't do so well, thinking we wanted to think big and then start big as well. I think I'd rather now say, well, think big and start small and postpone those larger, more complicated sections of the implementation until the later stages. Keep your eyes on the provider and not just the product. As I mentioned, during the procurement, we were very conscious about that. But it's also a matter, I think, of making sure that if you're assessing your relationship with a provider based on your relationship with certain people within that provider, to get like real guarantees that you'll be able to continue working with these people after you sign a contract, for example. Get an eye on what the internal dynamics in the vendor are. I think that as well. This is probably, I think, the most important lesson for us as Oxfam, is that unless you've got real good guarantees and you're willing to pay substantial additional amounts of money, test the system, and what you see is very probably what you will get in terms of a platform. So instead of relying on the vendor making a lot of promises on what they were going to develop for us, we really should have spent much more time testing the actual platform, looking at what it was able to do, and assume that that was what it was going to do for us. And anything in addition to that would be benefits. That would have been a much more sensible approach, really. And in connection with that, just forget about the contract. I think we spent far too much time creating a 100+ pages contract with a lot of details in it. It's not helpful. From the point that, with the vendor, you need to start waiving that contract and putting that on the table, the relationship is in shambles. And that's not where you want to be. You don't want to be in a place where you need to start waiving the contract. So having an honest conversation about what their tool is actually able to achieve and making them really understand what you need, I think is much more important than having all of that detail on paper. Do a lot of reference checks and do them with the right customers with similar setup in terms of volumes and complexity, etc., I'd say. And get the vendor to want you, but not want you too much. I'd say it's really important that you get in touch with a vendor that really wants you as a customer, because if they don't want you, they will not make the effort to really understand what your use case is and assess what the implications for them are. The thing is, if they want you too much, they won't make that effort either, because they'll say, whatever, at any cost, we'll want this customer. And they'll sign you up, and then afterwards you'll run into it just as well, because they haven't assessed your case very, very deeply. So get them to want you, but then not too much. Take your time and earn credits. We didn't want it to take that much time, but the fact that it's taken so much time has helped me, at least, to earn credits and then build that trust within the organization, which was really helpful to deliver the project. Document your choices if you're in an international, quite complicated setup as we are, because if you don't, your choices will come back to haunt you. Make sure that it's not just your choices, but involve people and document the choices that you make, because you'll have to get back at that documentation at some point. And then 10th and last, but not least, I think paraphrasing Baz Luhrmann's song, your choices are half chance and so are everyone else's. Please remind yourselves that there's only so much that you can control, and certain things are going to happen beyond your remit of control. And I find that also a very comforting thought. And I think that's my last slide.